Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to some more gear-obsessed maniacal ramblings. In heavy reflection, today's topic of choice is one that sparingly gets discussed in the consumer electronics review space, but to my knowledge, never really sees the light of day when it comes to musical gear and especially guitar-related equipment. And that is the concepts of e-waste and what I'll be referring to as landfill gear. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have already heard the term e-waste, a not so shortened abbreviation of electronics waste. It's been a topic of conversation for literally decades at this point, but it's become more prevalent as everything around us becomes more electrified and smartified, if that's a term. Something as simple as, let's say, throwing a broken toy away 30 years ago, if you're a kid, or for a lot of us, if we were a kid and, oh no, my Transformers arm broke off, crap, it's totally, we can't repair it, I need a new one. Whatever, toss it in the dump. Yeah, it's plastic, it's not good for the environment to just throw that stuff in a landfill, but especially around that time, didn't really have much of a choice. But now, that has such a larger implication because you can pick the most unassuming random toy off of the shelf at Target, and there's a pretty good chance that it has a lithium battery and a printed circuit board in there, and tossing something like that straight into the dump has both environmental and personal safety complications attached with it. First of all, something like a lithium-ion battery especially, if it gets punctured or overheated and expands and cracks, that could potentially really hurt someone or explode and maybe maim someone if they're nearby. That's why you're not allowed to take lithium-ion batteries over a certain capacity on an airplane in the event that something does get damaged and ruptures. So you don't want to toss that straight into the trash for that alone, especially for the sake of that garbage man we take for granted working on a 100-degree Fahrenheit day. But there's also the resource aspect of this discussion. Yes, on planet Earth, we have a shitload of copper and silicon that makes up the printed circuit boards and integrated circuits and small components that you'll find on anything from your smartphone to even one of these overdrive distortion pedals. But they are finite resources, and it doesn't make even logistical sense to throw something away that is even 99% good, even if it's 50% good, straight into the dump, because a lot of those components can be recycled. And so, yeah, hopefully you are taking advantage of your nearby Best Buy, or maybe you have a better recycling program than my city does, and you can dispose of unwanted or broken electronics that way, and hopefully they'll be reintroduced back into the system, because it takes exponentially less energy to take something that's already semi-refined and get it back into a malleable state than it is to, say, mine raw aluminum ore and then melt it down. E-waste is an unfortunate inevitability, if for no other reason that we are so dependent and oftentimes clumsy with our electronics. But beyond that, even a lot of components that make up these electronics do have a service life attached with them. Something will break eventually. Stuff like electrolytic capacitors can handle so many cycles within a temperature range, but you expose it to higher temperatures and it doesn't get properly cooled, or it's really stressed all the time, more than likely it will degrade or hopefully not explode, but sometimes they used to do that. Oftentimes, though, you can replace a lot of these components and get something that is back in working order. Things like, classic big muff pedals or even fuzz faces. Yeah, sometimes a lot of these old components have drifted and extended beyond their service lives, but a couple relatively affordable repairs and you have something that, besides maybe a scratchy pot or two, works the same as it did 50, 60 years ago, which is pretty incredible, especially by today's standards. And that brings us one layer deeper into this conversation with right to repair, a phrase you might have heard tossed around when it comes to smartphones and laptops and tablets, but it affects everything from farming equipment to graphics cards when it comes to repairability and true ownership. In fact, companies like Apple and John Deere in recent years have been in hot water over some of their shady practices when it comes to warranties, when it comes to allowing third parties to repair their obviously faulty designs. And it ultimately calls into question, do I own this device or don't I? If everything breaks warranty, if anytime I, loosen a screw on the back of an enclosure to fix something that is not my fault, then do I even own this $3,000 laptop or $500,000 piece of farming equipment? Certainly, swapping out the integrated circuit on a rat pedal is nowhere near the level of complexity of repairing an engine control unit. I get that. But this sort of issue really brings to light just how many companies out there are purposefully sabotaging their products through software and hardware designs to prematurely fail or just be completely irreparable when the smallest subassembly goes bad. No, we can't replace the daughter board for this USB controller. We got to replace the entire motherboard, or actually just throw away the entire laptop and buy a new one. We might give you, a couple $100 credit here for being a loyal customer. But not only is it a complete middle finger to the consumers, but it's environmentally disastrous because you've spent all this manufacturing time and effort, and you have all these resources that are otherwise good, completely usable, and maybe best case scenario, they end up in a refurbished product, but a lot of the times they just get scrapped. And yeah, hopefully they do get recycled, but it's a total waste. And that, my friends, is not even the tip of the spear, as the product types that I've been discussing so far are otherwise fairly well designed, competitive, fit in some sort of prosumer to commercial category. They're not completely junk outright. They just have repairability and design issues. But there's far worse out there than your Apple laptops or John Deere tractors when it comes to what they call landfill electronics. I have one that could be considered just that in the palm of my hand. This is a USB stick with a Darth Vader enclosure on it that I use as just a little, some little figurines and stuff on the shelves for decoration, because that's about all it's useful for. This is 256 megabytes, okay? Now, 15 years ago, that wouldn't be too bad. I could probably use this for my elementary school and middle school projects and load up a few PowerPoints and, maybe some Word documents and whatnot. But oftentimes, even nowadays, I, at work, have Excel spreadsheets that are bigger than the capacity of this thing. I'm almost positive my desktop wallpaper folder wouldn't fit this, and I know for a fact I have uncompressed audio recordings of narrations or guitar audio that exceed the capacity of this thing. Now, I just said 15 or so years ago, this would be a pretty decent amount of storage, so why am I ragging on it so hard? Because this came out 2 years ago. I've had this thing not that long and received as a keychain gift, obviously. But it is so obsolete, so out of touch with the competition that most people are just going to view this as expendable. Oh, lost it, no big deal, whatever. And the most insulting thing about it is it's not even remotely priced in terms of dollar per megabyte of storage. If it was the same amount of value, then it'd be not a big deal, right? It's like, well, yeah, I would rather carry around 500 gigs or 250 gigs on a keychain than this because it's the same amount of space, of course. But yeah, if this was 10 cents, then okay, yeah, that's, at least reasonable cost. But it's not. It's like $8 or $9 because it's got this stupid little Darth Vader covering on it, which is a terrible value. And we see this everywhere in consumer and cheap electronics. Oftentimes, yeah, they're cheap for a reason, but they're not proportionally cheaper. They're still trash at the end of the day, and you're paying maybe 50% of the cost of something that is 5% as good as something that if you just spent twice as more and got that better quality set of headphones or that better quality, higher capacity USB drive. And so we have this whole sea of electronics that is faulty outright or just totally obsolete. And most people are just going to treat them like trash when they're done with them. Now, when's the last time you heard those kind of concepts brought up in a review for musical equipment? Because I couldn't really tell you. And in total fairness to those who are making the review and even tech journalists, where this gets brought up far more often, who has the knowledge and resources to test a lot of this stuff? Who knows about these issues until they become an issue, right? How can we open up a guitar pedal and say, yeah, this is badly designed, or they're not going to support the warranty on this, and this is more likely going to break in this many years, right? Who's going to do that? But you don't know until it becomes a problem, or if, 6 months down the line, there's some big plague of issues because you got a bad batch of components. And we've seen that in computer hardware before. So I don't necessarily blame any of the, especially consumer reviewers, for not bringing up these things. But I think there are some telltale signs, especially with, decades and decades of hindsight behind us, to look at gear and go, yeah, this was probably not manufactured with repairability or serviceability or a long lifespan in mind. So with that, I'd like to turn my sights to some of the gear that's sitting on this desk and even some virtually to kind of talk about why I think there are some potential issues in especially the guitar industry, but all musical equipment in general. Let's start with a classic, the Proco Rat, which the original series were manufactured right here in the good old USA, hand-assembled, custom PCB, through-hole components. The Rat 2 and a lot of its offshoots are now manufactured overseas on printed circuit boards. Still a lot of through-hole components on here, but these things have always been super rugged. Yeah, if you buy one from the late 70s, early 80s, you might have to repair it. But those things are going for hundreds and hundreds of dollars just due to their collector status, even though that fabled op amp doesn't really sound any different than the one that's in here, but I'll let Josh Scott defend that point. The point being is a lot of those Rat pedals have lasted decades and decades without the need of any service. And, working out some scratchy pots and maybe a couple component replacements here and there, and you have a brand new pedal. They've always been in these super rugged metal enclosures, even if they are a little weird on the form factor side of things. And they solved the power delivery issue with it being a kind of a non-standard pinout on the original Rat series with this one. So anybody and their brother that has a 9-volt adapter will be able to use this pedal on their existing board. And if you look at all the components, there's nothing crazy on here, right? I mean, this is one of the starter pedals for a lot of modders out there because it is relatively accessible. The Rat 2 is a little harder to mod from my understanding due to the layout, but it's still doable. And if something blew on here or, you had a cracked solder joint or whatever it might be, it can be repaired. And I'd say about any Joe Blow guitar shop technician that messes with pedals can access this and work on it. It comes apart fairly easily. I just took this off with a thumb screw. Really, it's a hex screw, but you can do it with your thumb. 4 screws here, the chassis apart, and pop the knobs off. It's really easily serviceable if you need to service it, and they're just known for being rugged and reliable. This is a really great guitar product, especially coming in at 70, 80 bucks if you pay that much for it. And being that this is so readily available on the used market for cheap, you probably won't even have to pay full price for this thing. Though with that said, pricing things too low, making them too accessible, can have some unintended consequences. Let's take, for example, the Behringer HM300. Of course, they have a lot of these Boss knockoff pedals in this plastic enclosure, and you can get a lot of them from Sweetwater, at least you used to, maybe pricing's changed again, for a flat 20 bucks, which is crazy. You can barely buy a lunch for $20 anymore. And that is awesome for those who either don't want to spend the money or literally cannot afford to spend, $180 on the Waza version of the HM2 or, $90 on a Tube Screamer when, especially if they're just going to be in their bedroom practicing, you get pretty much the exact same sound. It's not like these things are badly built when it comes to the circuit boards. The enclosures, I wouldn't necessarily take this on tour with me without having 3 or 4 backups just in case, but they're solid, and for the money, they are an incredible value. Here's the problem with that. If I am someone that's out touring or even, say middle school, high school kid with, a paper route or something, if this pedal breaks, being that it's $20, whether a knob snaps off, you break the potentiometer or something happens to the circuit board, somehow water damage, it is so commoditized, it is so cheap that I'm probably just going to throw the whole damn thing away and buy one outright, right? It's 20 bucks. You have just ended the transaction right there. Otherwise, how much trouble do you have to go through to get it repaired? Well, best case scenario, you or someone has the equipment and parts on hand and will repair this thing for free. But more than likely, you take it to a shop, if they can work on it, you're going to be charged parts and labor. Hell, the part itself could potentially cost a significant fraction of the pedal. And then by the time you add on 30 minutes to an hour of labor, you've probably already exceeded the cost of just buying one of these things new, not to mention lead time, which is, a few days free shipping off of Sweetwater, assuming they're available. So this is where we start to get into this kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Yes, I very much support the low-cost models of a lot of these mass-manufactured pedals. It's kind of a gateway to allow players to get into sounds they otherwise would never be able to access at their exorbitant price points for a lot of the originals or boutique versions of some of these tones. But in the event that something does go wrong with them, then, well, it's like you would probably be more likely to hold on to something that you paid more for because it means more to you. And then you get into the whole issue of you just tossed perfectly viable, usable components and copper into a landfill. So I have mixed emotions about it. With that said, this example is far more straightforward than a lot of the right to repair conversations that happen, because all this stuff is just analog circuit paths, right? There's not really anything proprietary there. A lot of this stuff is simply off the shelf that you can buy, reels full from DigiKey for literally pennies a lot of the times per component. And so as long as the circuit board is in working order, you can probably replace every single part on this pedal if something were to go wrong and get it back to being functional again. However, this starts to get a little more complicated when we talk about digital gear, because some of this stuff is very much proprietary, not only the software, but maybe the way that they've programmed even an off-the-shelf, read-only memory chip. So let's say I try to turn on this Mimic doubler one day and it just doesn't make a sound, or maybe it makes just a horrifying sound. And you would know this because it is true bypass, so trying to engage the pedal would make some effect that you don't want. So you can remove the back panel relatively easily, but then you're presented with this sub-assembly cover, which you can again remove with some sort of Allen wrench. Oh, this is Torx actually, so kind of designed so most consumers would not have this set. I of course do, but more than likely, if you take this off, you're not only going to be presented with smaller surface mount components, you're going to see that these jacks are probably mounted to the PCB as well as the potentiometers, and there might be some ribbon cable action going on depending on what kind of digital device you have, but there's probably some microcontroller in there and some level of memory like EEPROM that has been flashed with firmware and all of the bits that this thing needs to do its digital job. Now, mechanically speaking, maybe you find a lifted lead or something on a component. It could probably be fixed by anybody that has solder skills, and if it's, large enough at least to get an iron down in there or some reflow. But maybe that component got fried in the process, or the firmware on board that memory got corrupted and now it just doesn't work at all. Well, there's a potential you might be able to get an RMA from this thing if you didn't, jump into that process immediately. There's a potential you'd still have to pay a decent amount of money for that. Maybe this gets refurbed, maybe it doesn't. And this pedal and many like it are among a class of kind of the four horsemen of the EWaste apocalypse when it comes to guitar gear. And I really like this pedal, but it has some things working against it in terms of being repairable, in terms of it being user-friendly and serviceable. First of all, this is a digital device, which doesn't inherently make it more complicated than an analog circuit path, especially for some of the more complicated stuff we talk about. But in general, you're dealing with a small computer, which turns your skill set from needing to be a good analog analyzer to a digital one, which isn't always one for one. You got to know about clock rates and what the firmware is doing and how the ROM's communicating with this thing. And that leads to number two, proprietary software. There's a pretty good chance that for a lot of the more popular effects that we talk about, there's a circuit diagram out there of a Marshall Plexi, of a tube screamer. You can work off of that. Who in the world besides TC Electronics is going to have some circuit path diagram and schematics and white papers on this pedal? They wouldn't want to share that. Number three, this is a really specific niche effect. It's not like a flanger or chorus or a lot of the other digital effects that TC makes that you might be able to pull some of your knowledge base from one or the other and kind of figure it out if you do happen to know about it. You kind of need all that information up front with this because it is so specific. It's not really comparable to anything else. And perhaps most damning of all, number four, it's really not that popular, right? We could have all those factors involved, but if John Mayer and 15 other big artists were using this thing and everyone had it because they wanted to buy it and they wanted to, dissect it, you can still work off of that. There's a lot of effects out there like that. They're like, this is really weird. It's a digital thing, but maybe someone wants to learn how to clone this pedal and sell it. and they'll spend the time and resources to do so. We've seen that before with the digital effects. I mean, hell, you could say that a lot of Behringer's business model is to rip off other digital modeling. So you throw that in a blender with a relatively affordable price point of, $100-ish, which again is more than what we talked about earlier. But if something goes wrong with this and you're in a hurry and, you don't want to go through any RMA crap, or maybe it's out of warranty, there's a good chance, due to the complexities and the issues we just talked about, this thing is going to end up right in the trash instead of worked on or refurbished. So this kind of exists in this no man's land of effects where I really like it. I think it's a pretty decent value for what it does, but I could foresee it causing these kind of problems in 20, 25 years. Speaking of which, we actually have a product here that we might be able to speak about in hindsight when it comes to a long-term investigation with the Line 6 Pod. Digital modeling is a dime a dozen nowadays. You can probably get a free smartphone app that has more tones and effects on offer than this thing, but at $400 back in 1998, 99, this was a huge deal. It was a bit of a revolution, honestly, in guitar effects, even if there were, some other companies already in the game at that point. This one was the one that sort of stuck in the hearts and minds of most people. 20-ish years later, though, of course, this has become a bit of a joke among some people, and I don't think that's necessarily fair to the original here. I think the XT generation has aged far worse, as shown in my videos on that topic. But this isn't exactly something you're going to see on a pro player stage anymore, right? There's some, especially analog effects, but even some digital rack units that have maintained legendary status because they do something that other effects just do not do, and they sound great doing it. But when it comes to something like the Pod, which does a few amp models, few time-based effects, and you got a tuner and presets and whatnot, it's been completely eradicated over the years in functionality by not only Line 6's product stack up, but competition going all the way up to the high end, and like Axe FX 3, all the way down to Hot Tone and Pero and Moore. So while the Red Kidney Bean withstood the tests of time in terms of still working and sounding just like it did on launch day, despite some nicks and scratches and drops, I'm sure, over the years, it actually kind of outlived its usefulness in a lot of ways because most people just aren't hanging on to these. They're not using them in the studio anymore. Yeah, I've got one for fun, but you're probably not going to hear it on any professional recording nowadays unless you really just love that Fear Factory Digimortal tone. Don't get me wrong, I applaud Line 6 for making a product that has lasted this long and still sounds the same. But what happens when that day comes when stuff does stop working? Yeah, some of this stuff is, kind of off the shelf, but from a circuit standpoint, where are you going to get these parts? And even when you do repair it, where are you going to get the software to reflash this thing? And this is relatively simple by today's standards. Now, some of the ROMs and firmware do exist online, and you can actually buy an EEPROM that has different firmwares on them, as I have done. But we're getting to a point where when stuff does start breaking, no one's going to know how to work on them. And I don't think any real digital device like this, especially an all-in-one unit, is really designed with longevity in mind. Even goes for stuff like Axe FX, which the Fractal Audio System customer support is, bar none, the absolute best in the world when it comes to guitar gear, in my opinion. I'll ask you what's wrong. If you can't figure it out with the steps that they give you, they've already sent you postage, and you just send it back, and you get it back within, like 10 days. Absolutely incredible stuff. And that I appreciate. But one day, the time for the Axe FX Standard and Ultra will come as well, and I'm sure they're not going to have parts, and when something goes wrong, it's done for. So despite me championing hardware amplifier modelers for years now, there is something to be said about the longevity of tube amplifiers. And again, all those individual components have some sort of life associated with them, and the more complicated the circuit, the worse it is, the more expensive it's going to be to work on. But especially for more simple circuits like a Marshall Plexi Super Lead or a JTM 45, stuff that is well beyond 50, 60, 70-ish years old at this point, replace a few capacitors, maybe mods a couple times here and there, and you're done. It still works just like it did when it rolled off the assembly line, which you cannot say about computers that are 25, 30 years old most of the time. I mean, you'd be laughed out of the room if you were using a 30-year-old IBM at this point. But yet here I have amplifiers that are almost as old as me, actually one of them that is older than me, and that's just completely normal. That's what they were designed to do because they are timeless in terms of their circuit designs and their tones. Perhaps some of these digital modelers and synths and other hardware like that will have such a foothold in the industry that stuff like an Axe Effects will have unlimited support for the next 50 years. There will be a dedicated group that's like, I'm not letting this thing die. I hope that comes to fruition, but I'm not really counting on that. And so again, as much as I love the Fractal AX8 and FM series, I have to come to grips with the fact that there's probably a good chance later down the road I want to try to turn it on and it's just not going to turn on that day. And that'll be sad. Hopefully it never comes. Hopefully they're built to some ridiculous class 3 or mil spec and they just keep chugging. But there's probably a lifespan associated with those products. And with the increased costs of manufacturing, R&D, and all the e-waste issues that we just talked about, I think that's why the industry continues to heavily move towards plugins, whether it be for a guitar amp, mixing applications, whatever. Because this stuff, assuming you can run it on some x86 or Mac architecture down the road, is quite literally timeless. I mean, the code is code, right? It's going to sound that way as long as the hardware interfaces correctly and you can run it on whatever CPU combination that exists 50 years or 100 years from now, whether it be emulation or, straight on the die, it's going to sound the same. And I think it is an unfortunate side effect of a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. Now, one of the unfortunate side effects of the plugins is that whereas one of these pedals draws what? Maybe, let's see what this says. It doesn't give you the milliamps, but a lot of this stuff is in the realm of, 100 to 500 on the high end for some of the digital multi-effects. That computer at idle is probably drawing more than an amp just sitting there because it's running, a high-powered graphics card and CPU and cooler, and I'm not even playing guitar through this thing. So, you got up to 750 watt draw on this PC to run this thing, and obviously it's not going to take that much power, but, this amplifier wide open hits 50 watts. And I will never, ever play it that loud. And yet I'm wasting more energy running a software equivalent that, I don't think we're really taking into account there. Yes, in terms of upfront costs and accessibility, it's great that we're moving more and more towards digital modeling, but maybe we're not considering just how much more power we're using as a result and the infrastructure costs associated with that. Yeah, for a laptop or, these other devices that sip power, not going to be an issue, but there's a lot of us at home that are running something that is going to use a hell of a lot more juice than even a full amplifier stack and pedal board to record guitar with. Just a thought. So with that, I'm not here to make some big sweeping environmental statement or to judge you for buying one product or the other. This is simply to bring to light stuff that I don't think ever really gets covered in guitar or musical gear reviews. It's just something to think about going forward. Because my advice when it comes to buying really anything, but especially entertainment gear like this, is afford the best that you can at the time. Don't skimp out, $5 on something that is half as good, because it's just going to end up in a landfill eventually, just like we talked about with the USB case. If you can't afford that extra $5, you probably shouldn't be buying that thing to begin with. Save up a little bit more, pay your damn bills. But there is something to be said with some of this gear where, yes, you can get the exact same sound from this pedal out of something that costs $19, right? But this is one of those cases where, having said all this, maybe you should just go ahead and buy the $60 one if you're sure you want it, because it's definitely going to last. And I think it'll mean more to you long term. So it's all this big balancing act between value and what makes sense in terms of making the most out of a product, especially when you're making it out of finite resources. Anyhow, any other questions or comments, please leave those down below. We'll see you next time with something that's probably a little more on brand for me. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.